Welcome. I'm Bruce Shapiro. I'm Executive Director of the DART Center for Journalism and Trauma. I see some folks from Columbia Journalism School who know us well, some journalists who know us well, but also a few other folks you may not know us. The DART Center convenes journalists, clinicians, researchers to strengthen our ability to tell stories of violence and its aftermath, as well as to strengthen psychosocial support for news professionals who cover the most difficult stories. www.dartcenter.org. If you're interested in learning more about the many programs that we do. One of the DART Center's programs, one of our flagship programs, is an annual seminar called the DART Center Ochberg Fellowship, named for a psychiatrist named Frank Ochberg, who was one of the co-founders of the DART Center, along with me and a few other folks. This program brings together 12 to 15 journalists from around the world to talk about the challenges of covering violence, crisis, and tragedy, whether at the most intimate sphere of intimate partner violence or family violence, all the way up to war, climate change, and disaster. One of those DART Center Ochberg Fellows back in, 2015?
No, actually, 2017.
2017, right, was my friend and colleague Ismail Einashe, who is I put the bios over here. Big, glorious stand-up.
Oh, thank you, Bruce.
Well, you I don't necessarily even need the bio for, but Ismail is a multi-award-winning journalist from the UK, much of whose work focuses on displaced and forcibly migrating folks. His work has appeared in The Guardian, the BBC News, the Sunday Times, Foreign Policy, the New York Times, Freeze, Art Review, and The Nation, among many others. He's been a finalist for the European Press Prize, winner of a number of other high-level awards. He's also the co-founder of a remarkable project called Lost in Europe, an investigative reporting effort which brings data reporting, human source reporting, and others together to track invisible populations, people who are forced into migration and who get trafficked in the course of their experience. Remarkable investigative reporting, a kind of project that has never existed before. He is on the editorial board of Tate, Etc., the magazine of the Tate Galleries, and he's the author of the beautiful book that has brought us together today, Look Again, Strangers, published by the Tate Gallery. We'll hear more about that later. But if you haven't yet bought your copy, before you leave, over there, do it. In return for the free lunch, buy this beautiful book, which comes not only with Ishmael's wonderful writing, but with gorgeous plates. It's really worth doing. Immediately next to Ismail is Tania Bruguera, who, if you've been following the news over the last few weeks, you would have seen her name causing a small ruckus in Berlin with a piece of performance art. She's one of the subjects of Ishmael's book. But causing a small ruckus is what she does. This is, right? Is that fair?
It's a way of thinking.
She, interestingly, and through a strange historical coincidence, Ismail has been a DART Center Ochberg Fellow. Tania has made a gorgeous film, Tania Libre, with our friend Frank Ochberg, in which the two of them are talking and interrogating some of the psychic and political forces that collide around censorship and violence and displacement. Tania, to read the official biography, is a political performance artist who explores the relationship between art, activism, social change, and political and economic power. Born and raised in Havana, several of her exhibitions have interrogated and represented key events in Cuban history. She explores both the promise and failings of the Cuban Revolution through performances that provoke viewers to consider political realities masked by government propaganda and mass media interpretation. She's here, in part, because in 2011 she started Immigrant Movement International, a multi-part artwork that ran through 2015. She spent a year living in a small apartment in Corona, Queens, with 5 undocumented immigrants and their children, engaging both local and international communities, as well as working with social service organizations, elected officials, and artists focused on immigration reform. Tania examined growing concerns about the political representation and conditions facing immigrants and migrants. As part of the work, she launched an Immigrant Respect Awareness campaign and an International Day of Actions on December 18, 2011, which the UN designated as International Migrants Day. And she now is Professor of Performance Studies, Director of Performance Studies?
Director, no.
No, Professor of Performance Studies at Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and she was kind enough to get on Metro North, or on Amtrak rather, to come down here. And next to Tania is a Dart Center colleague and collaborator, Dr. Kate Porterfield, PhD, a consulting clinical psychologist at the Bellevue Hospital Program for Survivors of Torture. She works with us at the Dart Center, helping journalists understand the experiences of profoundly traumatized and violated individuals, families, and communities. But as a clinician, she's provided clinical care to adults, adolescents, and children who've experienced war and refugee trauma and torture for over 20 years. She consults to issues pertaining trauma. She's been a consultant at Guantanamo Bay, in key death penalty trials, elsewhere in U.S. courts, at the International Criminal Court. And she's also a founding staff member of an important Dart Center project, the Journalist Trauma Support Network, which trains clinicians to provide meaningful therapeutic interventions for journalists who need it. You can read a lot more about her, but I would also say that she is a little bit of a performance artist herself. She's trained with and continues to teach at the legendary Second City Improvisational Theater. So we'll see if we get any performance art out of her today. I want to start by talking a little bit about this book that we're here to celebrate today. And rather than impose my language, I'm going to steal a little bit of Ismail's, because early on in this book, in talking about its motivations and about why, as a journalist, we might want to be looking at art and thinking about how art reflects, distorts, can serve, can damage the experiences of migrant communities. He says, art can tell us a lot about immigration that politics cannot. It can allow us to sidestep dehumanizing language and problematic representations and offer us a deeper window into the emotional and human journey of the migrant. And then he goes on a little later, art about migration does not have to be overtly political to allow us to sit with a stranger. It can be about everyday experience, such as food, rituals, sensory layers, feelings of home. Right? As I was reading those words, I was thinking about the work that those of you who are students here, those of you who are journalists here have to do, which so much is about sitting with people we don't know and sitting with strangers and trying to absorb, bridge, and represent some of that experience. And we so often find ourselves on terrain that is beyond words and beyond facts, even though that's what's usually in our toolkit. So I think today we're going to have a little bit of a conversation about that space between words and reality, the space that art can rush into, the space that clinicians who work in the beyond language zone of people's brains can also guide us with. And maybe we'll have a good conversation about art, but also a conversation that leads us to think about our own toolkit as journalists and how we should go about this work that we do. Ismail, I want to start out with you. Maybe if you could talk a little bit about your own journey to this book, and I mean journey on multiple layers, right? You are someone who made a big journey yourself as a child, which you may choose to talk about or not, now that I've put it out there on the table. As a journalist, you have journeyed to a lot of places. You tell stories of people who are making huge, epic journeys. You tell stories, though, with facts, with data, with interviews, all of that kind of usual stuff that those of us who are journalists in this room have in our toolkit most of the time. And you do it on the page or in sound. What was the journey that got you interested enough in looking at ways of seeing strangers to put it in a book, to engage, to think about these issues?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for all being here. Well, before I answer that, Bruce, actually, I just want to take this chance to thank you and the Dart Centre for organising this, and for all you wonderful people being here, and for Kate and for Tania being here. The last time I was in this room was in 2017 during the Ockberg Fellowship, and we watched Trump being inaugurated, and he spoke about American carnage. So it's a little bit of a change that we're here discussing this book that I published, Strangers, and having lovely sandwiches and lots of lovely people in the room. So just to say that, first of all. I mean, actually listening to you talk made me feel very emotional because it's been, as you say, journeys, both as a journalist who's been writing about violence that people who are migrants, who are refugees experience, particularly in Europe. A lot of my reporting has been in Italy, in Southern Europe, but also in the UK and in East Africa. So dealing with violence, what happens to people who are crossing borders, people who are experiencing all kinds of violence. And often those people I report about are young people, teenagers. So we're talking young people that are 15, 16, from all kinds of places. But predominantly in my reporting for the last 10 years, they've come from largely West Africa, countries like Senegal, Gambia, Nigeria, but also from East Africa, where I also come from originally, from Somalia, but from Eritrea and Ethiopia. So I've been dealing with trying to depict what violence does to the human body without even knowing about it for years before I found the language of trauma and understood actually the science of it. So that's one journey that, brought me here. And as I was telling that story over many, many years, I got really frustrated because the coverage in the media was really very negative. It's not a surprise, we all know that. When it comes to migration, when it comes to refugees, it's often very simple binary. They're either a threat, or they're a victim. There's nothing in between. The media coverage doesn't really talk about the nuances and the complexities of people's journeys. And in 2018, I was very lucky to be invited by Tania when she was doing her Tate Turbine Hall show at the Tate Modern in London. And Tania asked me to show her around my neighbourhood in Borough, where I lived for many years. And my dear friend Charlie in the audience also lived in Borough for many years. And we went around and got to know the neighbourhood through my eyes and through the experience of people who'd come to that area of London, which has always been a place of people moving, coming in and out. And it was because of that experience that I began to see migration not only through the lens of journalism or through reportage or data or investigations, but actually through the lens of art. In this case, in Tania's work, it was performance art, visual art. It was activist art. And I never really considered that as a lens before. And that was in 2018. And slowly, over the years, I really began to utilize art as a lens. Because, as you were just saying, the quote from the book, Bruce, that politics has, I think, failed to fully depict the reality of migrants and refugees. So we need art for us to look again and to think differently and more humanely and in some ways more profoundly about migration. And finally, I think the other part, also is the reason why I'm feeling very emotional is I'm thinking about journeys, I'm thinking about imagination and dreams and hopes, and I'm thinking about this concept in Somali. I was born in Somalia. I came to the UK almost 30 years ago this year, when I was 10 years old. And I'm thinking about a concept called bufis, which we were discussing just before upstairs. Many cultures have this concept, I'm sure, but in Somali, actually there's not really a translation into English, but it kind of encapsulates a sense of something being inflated or blowing something up. And the idea is that bufis speaks to the migrants' sense of hope and imagination about somewhere else. So when we're thinking about bufis, we're thinking about what our lives would be like if we didn't experience violence. What our lives would be like if we had a mum and a dad. What our lives would be like if our country was safe and we didn't need to make a journey that was thousands of miles in length and came at a huge cost. So it's also about the place of dreaming and place of hope. So yes, I'm interested in violence and what violence does to people and telling migration stories in that way. But this book, Strangers, was also for me a way to look at the issue and the subject of migration, which I'm so passionate about. I love it more than anything else. It's my life's work in a way, and I will never stop writing about this issue. But it's given me like a new sense of kind of rejuvenation to see it differently and see it through the lens of art.
And maybe just talk a little bit. You start out, the first piece of art, the first image you talk about in the book is a Hogarth painting from Calais. Mm-hmm. And maybe talk about that, and then since you were talking about Bufis, talk about the work that tries to capture that, because these are very different ideas of how migration gets depicted in art. Let's bring it into the art zone.
Yes.
Right?
So the work that you're referring to is William Hogarth, a painting from 1748, and it's called "Oh, the Roast Beef of Old England, the Gate of Calais." And you can see it there. It hangs.
Those of you who have the book, it's
Yes.
on right at the beginning on page 10.
And if you don't have the book, then there's a reason to buy it. But it hangs in the Tate Britain, and it's one of the most famous paintings in England. And it was really important for me that I began this book and this story here, because I was invited by the Tate to write this book as part of a series that the Tate does called Look Again, which reimagines the national collection of British art, which is about 500 years old, and mostly it's a lot of stolen art. For me, this painting is so important because it depicts the other in relation to England, in relation to Britain, and this gate of Calais. I mean, Calais for a few centuries was actually part of England, and then the French took it over. And now, hundreds of years later, Calais in the UK is like the physical, manifestation, but also the literal and the figurative and the imaginative manifestation of the border between Britain and the rest, and Britain and Europe. So for me, it was really important to begin in this place. And of course, in the painting, Hogarth, it has roast beef. I mean, English food is pretty good. People usually don't give it a good rep, but roast beef is like famously like, it's like, the foie gras of the English. It's the most famous, delicious thing. And he's using this. It's from a song from the era, which was celebrate roast beef as a kind of virtue of Englishness, and in contrast to the French. And in this painting, it's a satire as well. The French and the Catholics are depicted in a terrible light. Next to the English, which have all these wonderful virtues of superiority and so on. So this work was really important for me because it talks about this literal gate and this border, and it speaks to today in Britain, where we have what they call the crisis of the small boats. I don't know if those of you who've been following the news or know about the UK, have been there or from there maybe, but we've had this issue of people who are coming on small boats. Very few people who need help. This is a humanitarian crisis. And after many years, after which Britain watched what's happening in the Mediterranean with indifference, now we see this English Channel, which is, literally filling up with dead bodies and people are looking away. And to the other point about Bufis, the other work I should mention, which, thank you, Bruce. Thank you so much.
It's on, again, for those who bought the book already, it's page 17, Mustafa Syed.
Thank you, Bruce. So this work is also really, I feel I'm going to be emotional the whole day, by the way, because it's really lovely to be here, but also talk about this because, this stuff matters. It comes from the heart. Especially this book for me really came from the heart. And this work is really important. Why? Because it's by Mustafa Syed. He is a young Somali artist from Hargeisa. In the northwest part of Somalia, which is now called Somaliland. It's a separate country that no other country recognizes, but it's where I was born and where I'm from. And this work is really beautiful because it depicts the Somali landscape. So it's like the dry savanna. You can see it's basically a photo, and it's got this, fabric being thrown high up, and this fabric is it's called al-Hindi. It's basically fabric from India, or they call it Hindi or al-Hindi in Somali. And this work really speaks to, for me, the sensuality of home, and really speaks to, this beauty of the Somali landscape, which has been scarred by war and violence for a long time. And, when we think about Somalia, usually, I remember when I was growing up, I'll just briefly share this story, Bruce. When I was growing up, people would always say two things to me. They'd say, I'd mention Somalia, and they'd say Starving Marvin, which was a little thing that you saw from South Park, and it was like this image of the sort of Somali child who's bloated belly and starving. So that's the one thing that people knew. Or the other thing was pirates. And sometimes I'd joke with them and say, yeah, actually, my uncle is a pirate, so, I'm, I'm like, I'm the London chapter. But that was just a joke. But those were the two things that people knew about the country, so the violence, or the piracy, or the terrorism. And this work, for me, speaks about home and the connection to home, and it's a really beautiful work that I wanted to depict in the book.
Yeah. Tania, you, like Ismail, you are someone who has experienced displacement. In some ways, you're currently in a recent phase of displacement, of
involuntary displacement.
Involuntary displacement. You've also immersed yourself in the lives of migrant communities, and as an artist and activist, you're looking both out and in. When you look at the world of facts and numbers and standard quotes and stories, and then you are trying to make art out of what you experience and you see, which is rather different. Where does that lead you? How do you approach this?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I think I mainly work out of rage, of reality. And also from things I don't understand. There are certain things that I witness or I read about, and I'm like, how is this happening? It makes no sense. Everybody knows it makes no sense, but it's still happening. So I really like to delve there. You mentioned Immigrant Movement International. It's a project I did here in New York for almost 7 years. And the main point of entrance of the piece was thinking about how immigrants are stripped out of their political rights and how they become from being a political being into being an economic being, and how it's very hard to trespass that line that has been decided for you. And so the work was mostly about that. So basically we created a chapter where people, were protesting after, like they took out one person in the neighborhood council that was a racist person who was treating them really horrible. So I think it was more activist and art. And I feel that sometimes my work is almost, and talking about also immigration again, I think one of the things that I'm more sad about, let's say, or more concerned about is that immigration is generating the biggest knowledge waste in the world. Because you have all these people who are coming from other places with knowledge. They're not only coming with arms, to build. They're coming with knowledge. And as soon as you trespass those, territories that are fake, of course, who tell what is what, they are, and this is a lot of knowledge we're wasting. We should be more open to see what people are bringing, even politically. I remember an anecdote in the Netherlands where I was working a project and I visited a group of immigrants from different places in Africa. They were divided by countries inside the housing, and you had all these beautiful young, maybe 20 max year old Dutch ladies trying to tell them what to do. And these people were political refugees who organized parties in their countries. They were persecuted, were in prison. So I think that was the moment in which I'm like, why? You have to listen sometime to the listening should change and be analyzed in a different way. The other thing that is interesting is this sense of what is time. And that's something I use in my work a lot because I'm a performance artist and I try to, one of my main elements is time. How you rush certain things and how you make things last longer so you can analyze what is happening while it's happening to you. So I feel that I use art, as I told you before, as a way to rehearse reality. Yeah. Why? Because you're trying to rehearse a reality that doesn't exist. And I'm not saying that the one I propose is the correct one, but it's a collective exercise on imagination and a collective exercise on trying to feel what is missing. Because hopefully after you being in the work I've done, you go out to reality again and you are like, I want to feel the same way I felt 5 minutes ago in the artwork. And then hopefully it's a process of unlearning behavior, and it's a process of finding new behaviors that you have to generate in order to have a similar experience.
When we were talking a few minutes ago, and you raised before we came together here in the room, and you mentioned the idea of art as rehearsal for another reality. In thinking about forced migration, you talked about in particular, how difficult it is for people to understand who you are. And talk about how art making fits in with that and what you meant by that. Maybe, A, tell me what you meant by that, but B, what...
I'm sure everybody had the same experience here. I think for me, migration is a process of reinvention in which you are putting together something basically the propaganda of the place you're going to go. Because, if you are migrating to certain countries, you are attracted to it because what they told you it is going to be your life. And put this together with who you want to be, because finally you have the option to be another person, whether because nobody knows you, whether it's because you have opportunities you never had before. So I feel that there is a big tension between what you bring with you and what people are putting into you when you immigrate. You are an immigrant because you have to fight, tens and or even centuries of prejudice or the kind of writing on a story that you're not part of, but they make you part of.
Yeah. Kate, you spend your time listening to exactly these kinds of stories, right, of people who are trying to imagine a new reality and are building a bridge to a new life and are also living with the place and experiences that they left behind. As we've been having this conversation and as you read Ismail's beautiful little book, what's been in your mind?
Well, a couple things. I mean, first of all, it's very nice to be up here, and I was chuckling thinking that there is a joke, which is, a journalist, an artist, and a therapist walk into a bar. I mean, we got it, I was like, well, why are we up here, right, the three of us? And I just keep thinking, how did I get up here with these people? They're like brilliant thinkers, creators, right? And And I think that the idea is that, you know, what Ismail, what you do in this book is you remind us that art is an act of imagination. And what I see in my work working with people who've been traumatized is that imagination is the beginning of hope, that you can do something different, you can feel different. So I feel like journalists, artists, and therapists are adjacent in certain ways, right? Which is that they're trying to create meaning, right? They're trying to get involved in meaning making with people so that people can see there's another way, right? Or there's another way to think about this or look at it and not have it be a cliche or something stereotyped. And so first of all, I love this book. I've had it next to my bedside for since I got it, months. And sometimes at night I'll just pick a paragraph. I mean, your writing is so insanely beautiful. And then the pictures are incredible too. So get the book, it's really amazing. And what I loved about it was that you sort of do this thing about how migrants are viewed often in these like dehumanized ways, right? Black and white ways. They're desperate and they're surviving, right? And that thing you say about, well, actually boarding a dinghy is not just an act of survival, it's an act of imagination, right? I'm doing something now. I'm actively going to envision something different for myself. And that's what people do in trauma treatment. You know, trauma treatment, there's the way I like to think about it is two fast examples. A man who came into my treatment with me who had been held captive, who at the very beginning of our treatment was just very flat and blank, and when I asked him about it, had no emotion and nothing that would come out when he described these things, and that's what we call a sort of unintegrated response to trauma. You can't do anything with it because it's just living in your body and you're trying to stop it. And then I think in contrast of a man later, who I worked with, who had also been held captive, but who had had treatment and worked really hard, who could talk about his captivity in this incredibly complex way. He talked about what he gained from it, that I learned things, I made friends, I'm a different man now. And that's the task of integration, right? So that's when you can make meaning out of something. It doesn't have to exist in these black and white spaces or, just sort of opposing narratives of, dehumanization and cliche. So I really like that you remind us about art, even though you're a journalist. You remind us that art, along with writing, can do this, right? It can put us into spaces where things can be complex and rich and multi-layered, and that's what I believe in as someone who thinks that's how we heal from hurts. So I really love that, and I just want to say one more thing about it, though, which is that he does this in lots of other ways in his work that he's not plugging right now, which is Lost in Europe. And if you haven't gone to Lost in Europe, you have to go onto that site and see the amazing job that those journalists are doing, portraying stories and telling stories about people who are traveling. There's one graphic set of graphic stories that are illustrated, and then you can interact with the character by asking questions. It's amazing, and it is exactly what you're saying we need to do, right? Which is be complex and be humanizing in every engagement with people who've been hurt. So that's where I see our adjacency, I guess.
Ismail, I want to talk a little bit about the book's title, because you do, you kind of reject, you don't reject, but you in the course of the text, you talk about the limitations of our usual language of migrants, refugees, et cetera, right? And instead, you've entitled your book Strangers. Talk about that, why, what it means, and maybe what it means for art, and what it means for our thinking as journalists too.
Yeah, I think a stranger by definition is obviously can be someone who's strange to us, who's foreign, who we don't know their motives, we don't know where they're from. But I think what I'm saying is reclaiming that idea of strangers. And saying that stranger can also be a guest, which is another definition. They can become a friend. They can be neighbors. I think also the idea, we were discussing this before, is that I think I've always thought this for a while, especially after reporting on migration in Europe and in the Mediterranean so-called migration crisis. That's when I first went out there to start reporting and going to places like Puglia and predominantly Sicily, is that people's stories, it's like what Tania was saying, the tension between what you come with and what people put into you, and also the space that you're in, because for centuries and decades, there's been things written about migrants and, so people are swimming in this place. And what I found when I was reporting is that somebody who came from Gambia, usually they're Gambian, or Senegal, their countries are considered to be safe in Europe. So those people who came from those countries, when they got to Italy, would not automatically or even be given any pathway, really, usually, towards asylum. And that's the case in other places in Europe. And actually, those young people, when I sat with them and interviewed them, they would have told me an unbelievably harrowing, violent journey, which would go from all the way from Gambia, which I went to and I did reporting there, to all the way to North Africa, to Libya, where there would be slave markets where people would be sold. And then they would get on these very dangerous journeys, the quote that Kate beautifully mentioned from the book, this idea of setting out in hope. It came from these kinds of places that I was doing these stories. And that person would then be considered to have made their journey by choice. So then they're an economic migrant. So I think the idea of migrant refugee are out of date, and I think what we need to look at is people and look at their real experiences. And for me, strangers, and calling this book Strangers, was something really important to reclaim that and to sort of say, let's somewhat move away from this kind of binary of migrant refugee, because quite simply, if you're a migrant, the definition is that you've made it by choice, your journey. So whatever happens to you, and you're not going to get protection. But you're a refugee, then there's some protection, which of course is under threat. So I think the point is, I just feel very much, especially in Europe. So just to finish, just especially in Europe and in the UK, this whole conversation is so highly political. I don't know these states so well, and I haven't reported here, but I'm sure it's pretty similar. And as all this we just discussed today about what's happening in New York, but we need to unlearn these definitions and categorize them, because actually what happens is that we get into a place of deserving and undeserving.
Yeah. Yeah. It also strikes me, as I was reading your book and thinking about some of the artists whose stories you tell, that one of the great virtues of the book is that you're very honest about the complexity of the experience of being a stranger to these artists. And I think something all three of you would agree on is that it's important to face the fact that while there is always hope, aspiration, et cetera there, these stories do not always end well.
Yeah.
One of the people you talk about is Arshile Gorky,
Yes,
and maybe chat about him a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is this beautiful work, and actually he died here in New York in 1948. And Gorky was, it's really interesting because Gorky came here and he had invented this whole background that he was like some Russian gentry, like he was like some Russian noble, but he wasn't. He was, of course, Armenian. And No, he wasn't. But he came to New York and was, I guess, moving in the kind of art circle here. And, some of us, we all know that feeling, right? Being a stranger somewhere and thinking, well, I've got to invent a story, I'm sure I've done a few times. Not quite that extent. I haven't, but it's part of the migrant journey, and this work that he paints is really beautiful. It's actually one of three. This one is held in the Tate, and I think the other one is actually held in the Met, so you can go and see it here. And it's Guardian Scotchy motif, and it's from 1942, and it's quite an abstract piece. And what he's trying to do is he's basically trying to reconstruct the memories of his childhood, because he left Armenia when he was quite young, of his home. You can see it. Thank you, Bruce. And it's this idea of he's trying to piece together this fragment that is impossible to piece together because, and this is why I wanted to do this event here, by the way, and bring us all together, because looking at Kate, and working with Kate for some years, we both trained for the Dart Centre. One of the things I always remember when Kate does her trainings is that, when you go through trauma, people remember things imperfectly. And we're always trying to piece together a memory that is broken into 1,000 pieces. So how do you piece together a life? How do you piece together a home? How do you piece together a sense of yourself? How do you stop being broken? And I think what's really tragic about, Gorky ultimately is that, that to me, it sort of claimed him in a way, that longing for home, that sense of loss. And in this work, he's trying to bring that together, but it's almost impossible to reconfigure.
Yeah, and he dies by suicide, we should say.
Yes, sorry, absolutely, yes. And the inscription on his grave says, "Goodbye, my loveds," which is, really very beautiful. Actually, there's a film, because I think his daughters made a film about him and his time here, which is really beautiful. You should watch. But yeah, he was extraordinary. And I think also what is, I should also mention, of course, is that, he comes from Armenia, a place where there was a genocide that's been denied. So it's also, we're talking about countries where the violence that's happened to you has been denied by other people.
Yeah.
So how do you recapture a sense of who you are and where you come from? And also the home that it came from disappears, right? Because then the Soviet Union comes and then it's a whole new state. And then, so it's all these layers of violence that happens to people and how borders can move around somebody. But we are the ones who live with the pain and the fallout of what happens to us.
Yeah. Tania, how have you thought about that kind of the violence, the fragmentation, along with the kind of overtly political things, right? How does that find its way into your art? How do you wrestle with those different, with the truth telling about violence, fragmentation, pain, along with the hoping, imagined new realities?
First of all, I want to say buy the book, because I'm the only one who hasn't said that yet. So. Buy the book.
Unanimous. It's unanimous.
So is it unanimous?
It's a unanimous practice.
But thank you for the question. I think violence, and I'm learning a lot here from you guys today. Thank you for that. But I think is how you tell the story of violence, and how you tell the story of violence to people who don't want to listen. Because most of the time people don't want to listen to those stories. And also is, in my personal case, I'm a visual artist, I'm not a writer, so sometimes I'm very rebellious person, so I struggle with what people want to hear and what I'm saying, and also the way they want to hear it. Because there is also a kind of language that comes together with these discourses. And sometimes they also don't fit my experience, in my case, or your experience. And then you have an extra layer of difficulty because you are telling your story, seeing people who don't believe it, For example, something that people don't, because you're dealing with the lack of knowledge people have of the situation. For example, something that recently happened to me. Okay, I left, I was forced to leave, I negotiated the leaving, blah, blah, blah. I'm done. I come here and I'm like, I'm done. Cuban government is going to forget about me, they're happy, I'm left. Of course not. They created a campaign against my job, people trying to get me out of my job, and there are people related to the government. Why? Because they don't want me to be in a prestigious place. And finally, after 2 years of dealing with my traumas, I'm showing again work. It took me a while to go back to produce art, because sometimes you don't know what to do. Like the sensation is so big and so confused that you cannot compress it in one image or one moment. And then finally I'm doing that, and what happened? In Chile, I do a project, and I have the ¿cómo se llama? Testimony of this. So, in Chile, I do a project, and somebody from the Cuban government go to meet the Communist Party there. Nothing against the Communist Party there. They're great and they're very diverse. And they talk to a very specific part of the party. 3 days later, protests against my work, trying to close the project, trying to, Then now I'm going to Malta today, to a biennial. The ambassador of Cuba in Italy and in Malta, there's a double position, wrote the president of the biennial that they need to take me out of the show because I'm not a Cuban. That's the only passport I have, by the way. And they say no, and the guy came. I'm very curious. There is no resources for food in Cuba, but he has money to pay a ticket to go and take. So these are stories people are not used to hear. There are many, and it's not only about me. There are people who have been taken out of film festivals because they went there independently and so on. So there is a big machine that is invisible. And for me, is how do you tell a story coming from the I that is not about you. It has to come from I, because then other people will not believe it if you don't say it from the first person. But how to make sure it's not about you. It's about a system that also not only happens in Cuba, but can happen here as well. Like try to learn. Because I saw, especially when Trump came, I wrote in my Facebook like 7 things he was going to do. And he was not yet in the White House. And all my American friends like, no, you're wrong. This is not Cuba. We have a democracy. I said, we also had a democracy before. We had amazing institutions before. So it can happen anywhere, So I think this is, it's difficult how to put in language experiences that sometimes you don't know how to, even what you felt,
Well, it strikes me that what you're talking about, aside from the surface politics of it, is about, in fact, the kind of state or institutional violence that in different ways creates situations of refugees and migration. When you were in my office, you were sitting in front of a photograph of a writer who I actually found myself thinking in a different way about just with you sitting there, Hannah Arendt, who was a migrant intellectual, a forced migrant or a stranger. She became a stranger in Germany because of the rise of Hitler, and then lived as a stranger in the United States, wrote as a stranger in Israel about the Eichmann trial, and was made a stranger by parts of the New York Jewish community for things they didn't like about what she had written. Both the kind of institutional violence surrounding her life as an intellectual and the violence of various conflicts and societies continued in some ways to define her, and yet she sought to transcend it. How do you... All this that we're talking about is very much related to the state of democracy and where the migration issue fits in, or where strangers fit in with democracy and its crisis right now. And you're, as an artist, wrestling with that, it strikes me.
No, but also there is this situation where that is very strange, where sometimes migrants feel they cannot criticize the place they have hosted them or they have arrived. And it's a very difficult situation because sometimes you want to say things that are not agreeable to the people who the place, and it's a very interesting also another element, where you are like, yeah, I don't agree with this, but if you criticize, you are disgraceful because you are here protected by the place. So I think that's another layer of that has to be lived. Because if somebody's here, they should have the right to say what they think. That's why they are here. You're here or whatever, in Europe or whatever, no? And that's part of the waste knowledge that I was talking about before,
Yeah. Kate, when you're talking over time with your patients who have been through the most severe experiences of violence, sometimes state-imposed, sometimes through other means, and they are living as strangers, to use Ismail's word here, how do those of us who find ourselves professionally in conversations with migrants and refugees, what do we need to know about how folks are navigating that terrain of fear that Tania just talked about? That I'm here, do I criticize, can I not criticize, am I safe, am I not safe? What's going on when that vulnerability is on stage?
I mean, to me, it just brings to mind that one of the central things that human beings do when they get hurt is they want to make the feeling go away and they want to make the memory go away. I mean, you can't diagnose a person with a condition of post-traumatic stress unless they have avoidance as part of their symptoms. In other words, avoiding hurt is unfortunately what we humans do, even though it tends to be the opposite of what we need. We sort of need to move towards things that hurt so that we can open them up, look at them, put a light on them, clean them up for ourselves mentally, right, and bodily. So to me, what I would say about the question about how do we approach people who've been hurt is just to remember that avoidance, that silencing, that, you know, you're talking about political silencing, and there's also internal silencing that we do when we're hurt and scared and, you know, wounded, to try to remember that avoidance is part of it and give space and time, like time for the person to see that you are a safe person for them to share with, or you are going to tell their story the way Ismail and his team does it, Lost in Europe, with complexity and richness and beauty and celebration, rather than just with, you know, pat descriptions of you know, refugees. So to me, it's like approach, recognize that avoidance is the nature of being hurt, and then take your time and show respect. You know, you've told me stories, I know we're almost out, but you've told stories in our trainings before, Ismail, about stopping an interview, walking away and saying, you know what, let's not right now, when you think the person's hurting too much and that the interview is not being experienced safely. You know, a lot of journalists don't do that, right? And so it's part of the approach, I think, is to think about those hurts and where they are manifesting in the person's being able to tell or not what happened to them.
As you were talking, and also, Tania, as you were talking, I found myself thinking of how easily many societies, not just the US, not just the UK, how easily the migrant and refugee issue, for some reason, can tip over into violence. I spend some time in Ireland every year, a country that in the last decades has been enormously welcoming of migrants and refugees from many parts of the world, where recently there has been a tip, a small, narrow faction leading a tip into anti-immigrant violence, burning of hotels that might house refugees, one particularly violent street demonstration. It's not the sentiment of the country, but it is a pathway for which political resentment or other forces have found their way. Ismail, when you've covered these things, why is it? And there is a crossover to art. There's because it's about a different kind of imagination, the imagination of purity, the imagination of the society that once existed. Why does this happen? Why over and over are borders, migration, refugees, the issues that tip into resentment and violence?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Irish example is really interesting because, like you, I've spent a bit of time in Ireland and I've seen that change. I think because migration concerns people, it concerns us, and I think, you know, there's, you know, visible and invincible migration, and I think it kind of goes to the core sometimes, and I think often that is because it's weaponized by politicians, by states, and I think often, unfortunately, humans can also be, we can tend to, and that's where our politicians should come in and should, take on the responsibility of actually, putting in a discourse in the public sphere, which kind of lessens this. But what I was going to say is that sometimes we go very much with what we see, and that can be based on disinformation, and that can be based on hearsay, and that can be based on prejudice. And I think this issue of migration kind of sits at this nexus of both the changes that happen in a place where we live, but also the bigger changes that are happening politically, economically, and culturally. And sometimes it's just very easy to say, well, there's certain people who've just moved here a few days ago, a few years ago, a few centuries ago even, who are causing this. And I think that's where the stranger comes in. The idea is that the stranger doesn't need to be a threat. Like, we can make a choice. These choices are available to us. There are political choices, there are cultural choices, there are artistic choices that we can make. We don't have to make violent choices. And it's really, very important, and unfortunately our politicians are failing us everywhere, is that it also works. It's a political weapon that works, that goes to the place of fear. And fear is an emotion which can be very powerful, and very powerful politically. It can organize people into a political position. And I think that's why migration is so hot, and it's always at the center of so much.
Mm-hmm. Tania, how do you interrogate fear as an artist? That's a tough one, especially fear of the other, right? And it's...
Well, I don't know. I have an answer. That's a tough one. That's the problem. You have journalists in the room. So, but no, fear is sometimes I repress fear. Sometimes I avoid fear. But I think it is, as an artist, I use it as a material as well. And I try to put people. It is almost like a contract, on a spoken contract, where you enter a space where you're going to be vulnerable, but it's okay.
Yeah.
You know, and it's a way to not be afraid of being vulnerable and understanding how to deal with that. But my work is most than anything is to test propaganda, and is to put a mirror in somebody's face. I don't come with a predetermined right and wrong. Whatever happened is whatever today was in that place for that person, you know? So I think that is difficult sometimes for people.
Yeah. And Kate, when journalists find themselves on this terrain where fear is being created, what have you learned pushes back against fear? What have you learned from your work that we should be thinking about in our storytelling, in our imaginative work, in our looking at art, but also in our work as journalists? What helps in the face of fear?
Do you mean, and you're thinking about when the journalist is living in states of fear, or when they're trying to tell
sometimes,
stories?
or if we find it in those we're reporting on,
Yeah.
or if we're reporting on fear in society, just what you deal so much with terror at the heart of what you do.
Right. I mean, I guess my thinking is, fear is a state that basically is physiological, right? It follows threat, right? So threat in the body then leads to the emotion, which we think about. I'm afraid, right? So to be able to help someone who's in a state of fear is very hard, right? You're really at that point just thinking about calming the state of threat. And once people can, for trauma treatment, once people can see that the states of fear that are kind of ruling them don't have to stay in control, they can start thinking things like, okay, so what was this like for me? Why did it happen? What meaning do I make out of it? So fear, I guess my point is really just that fear is not usually a state in which we can think. Mm-hmm. So the job becomes, whether you're talking about fear, portraying fear, you're afraid. When you're afraid, you need to be made safe. That's what we need. Yeah. And so if you're not safe, it's really hard to do anything in this part of the brain, which is the part that makes meaning.
And it does strike me that some of the art you look at in your book is about pushing back against fear in a certain way. Talk briefly about that, and then we'll go to questions.
Yes, I'll keep it very brief, and I think I'm going to mention two things. One is the piece of Tania's work that I mentioned in the book, which is from 2008 from the Tate, which I won't mention now, but I'm going to actually mention the commission that Tania did in 2018 at the Turbine Hall, where you had you should probably talk about it, but you had this chemical which induced tears. Which maybe we can talk about in a minute, but that was all about your concept of forced empathy. So I was thinking very much about Tania's work. Tania's work is really important and central to this book, both as an inspiration, but also thinking about this intersection of art and migration. And I think that's what art can do. It can create a space of empathy, a space of connection and celebration. And the last image that I share in the book is a photo taken by Kate Stanworth, who is a dear friend of mine and a colleague, a collaborator of mine. She's a photographer, and we've worked together since we met in 2014. And this is a photo of a group of Nigerian women at a wedding in Palermo. And it's a beautiful moment. It's just them dressed up, looking their best. And actually, Kate took the photo. It looks really amazing, the photo, because it wasn't staged, and they're all looking at completely different directions, and they all have got a different pose. And it's just a moment of an ordinary situation, a wedding, and it's a moment of celebration and love. And I think that's what art can do. Art can allow us to see the humanness of the migrant, and I think it can also create a space of empathy, as Tania's work did in 2018.
So let's do a few questions from the room. We have about 20 minutes left before we have to give up this space. Crystal, if you could maybe grab the mic. Anyone have something you'd like to ask these wonderful thinkers and writers and colleagues, whether it's about what they've been talking about, their own work, your own work, things you've wondered? Yeah. Mike's in the back of the room there, so which we need just, oh, and by the way, this is being videotaped and will eventually be on the Dart Center's website. Don't say anything that will embarrass your grandmother. Or do embarrass your grandmother if that's your job in life.
So I just have a David from the MA program here at the Columbia Journalism School. And I just remember doing a reportage from Calais in 2015, where I had visited what they used to call the jungle, correct me if I'm wrong, which was basically this like mass of people. I was just wondering, I'm sure you kind of followed how the situation has developed over there more recently. So I was just wondering if you could say a few words about that situation.
Okay. I'll just be very brief. I haven't reported from Calais, so I won't speak specifically to that question. But what I will say is the situation at the border at the moment between France and England, of course, is very political of what's been happening in terms of the so-called small boat crisis. What I would say is that the reality is that the numbers are very small, and they very much are the case also in the Mediterranean. The numbers are small, but what we're seeing is the question that Bruce was asking: what is it about migration? The reaction is always completely OTT and isn't in line with the realities of what is actually happening. If we think about, for example, even in 2015 in Europe, if we think about the so-called crisis, I always put it in quotation marks because we need to put in quotation marks really, because it wasn't a crisis. It was a political crisis manufactured by those who wanted to weaponize the issue of migration. But Europe is a continent, of almost $20 trillion economy, over 500 million people. And yes, a huge number of people in comparison to previous years arrived, say, in 2015 is 1.3 million. Most of them were taken by Germany and were from Syria and the conflict in Syria. But actually, if you put that into historical perspective, it's very small numbers, and we know that the majority, this is the other point about this conversation, is that the majority of refugees, migrants, stay in the regions, for example, with refugees of conflict. So the countries who are actually hosting refugees, they're not in Europe, and they're not the United States. It's Ethiopia, which has got its own crisis, which is hosting refugees from Somalia or South Sudan. It's Uganda, it's Kenya, it's Turkey, it's Lebanon, a small country that is hosting, I think, almost close to 2 million Syrian refugees. So we need to bring a bit of proportionality to this conversation, which unfortunately doesn't exist. Yeah, sorry.
Hi, I'm Sarah. I've reflected a lot about the language we use about migrations, as you said, and this idea of not using migrant or refugee to describe a whole bunch of people. But I feel like sometimes as journalists, we are kind of forced to use this type of words because it's kind of the easy way, and it's maybe weird or not as beautiful to use people who seek refugee or people who migrate, because that word people, it's also kind of weird. And the same happens with the word crisis. It's so easy to describe what's happening as a crisis, and a lot of people, a lot of journalists do that. So my question is how to avoid those forces that push us to simplify realities, and how to, for example, describe people who are forced to migrate without using people who are forced to migrate, which is something an editor will cross, probably.
Okay, I will answer that very briefly. Please look at the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma Style Guide, which I did have a little help in putting together the sections on migration, because that gives a very clear definition. So from smuggling, trafficking, asylum seeker, these terminologies mean different things, and I know sometimes we have to use them, but be very specific about the context in which you're writing. And also just to say, have a conversation with your editor if you can, because I often have the same problem. I write for the same publications. I know the editors really well. In some cases, they're my friends, and I'll often find when I've submitted copy and it's been published, things like illegal would appear. And actually, I have to explain to them, no, you can't say illegal because that suggests criminality. It should be irregular. And also that can, create discrimination. Tania?
No, I was going to say exactly the same. My experience when I was working in the project of immigration here in New York is a journalist from New York Times who wrote, and he's illegal. And I say, no, they're not illegal. They're undocumented, they're unregulated or whatever. And it is almost as if journalists, no offense, forgot that journalism is also an educational tool. Yes. It's not only an informational tool, it's also educational. Yeah. And that's...
Yeah. And I think that is very much true what Tania's saying, is the point that Kate was making before. We as journalists have choices, and it's the reason why, I ended up being in the Dart Network and coming to the Dart Center, because I was frustrated with the ways in which the media tells this story. And I knew it was wrong, even when I was, a young journalist. I knew it was wrong to describe people in certain ways, but I didn't have the know-how or the skills and the tools. So I think if you guys, those questions you're asking me, you're studying here, you're doing your master's here?
Yeah.
You're in the MA program?
Yes.
Okay. And, it's fantastic that you're here because you have this amazing resource. So take your Columbia knowledge and take it to the world.
And I want to add one cherry on top of that sundae, which is that, for language, which is that I often say to journalists, don't ask someone about their trauma, don't, because it's not their trauma, it's their life, right? And so when we start putting our labels on things, we immediately shut people down. And when you're a therapist like I am, you say stuff to someone and you watch how your language just shut them down. You're like, oh, why did I say that? I recently talked to a guy about his childhood, and I said something about, when your mom abused you, and he said she didn't abuse me. She wasn't abusing me. She was hitting me and she was punching me. But that word was my word, right? So when the words we use, stay open and broad and reflect back what the person's using as their language, right? If it's not their trauma, it's their life. It's what happened to them. So I'm very interested in this idea too, which is the way we follow the language of someone who wants to tell us about what happened to them and not put our own language and labels on it.
And one last thing, I think people have mystified what change is too much. And change is to be patient and be persistent. Yeah. So then you have to work with all your editors and all, and maybe invite him to drink and tell him again and again and again and again, and tell him.
Get him to pay for the drink.
Yeah, exactly. You know what I mean? Persistence, and educating them first as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank
Sarah,
you so much.
Sarah, last question.
Hi, thank you all so much for being here. I think this has been a fascinating discussion, and I love this exploration of how art can open doors to empathy. But in my life, and I'm sure you've all experienced it as well, people are able to empathize with art because it's distant and it's fictional, and yet they cannot then translate that empathy into their daily interactions with immigrants or in the voting booth or in, whatever. So I'm curious your perspective on those dual mindsets, and also how we in our day-to-day lives can help sort of break that psychological wall, gently break the psychological wall.
And I think maybe let's do reverse order, because I want Ismail to have the last word. It's his event. Kate, take that one if you want.
I mean, it's a great question. I think for me, the answer is just stories. Stories are what matters. People don't want to hear generalizations and pontifications, and they want to know. Tell me about this person, because I've talked to people who on all kinds of political spectrums, and whenever you start telling them a story, for instance, about someone I'm working with who's incarcerated and facing a death penalty, they may have thought they were pro-death penalty, and they start listening, and they sort of say, well, wait a minute, what was the person's life? Oh, this happened to them? And so to me, you tell a story, and it allows a person to imagine something different. Maybe it doesn't change a mind, that's fine, but I think stories and details are everything.
Tania?
Yeah, for me, you're totally right of what you say about art, unfortunately. And this is what I'm trying to fight against. And I have two tools, let's say, that I use. One is the idea of behavior art, seeing art as a behavioral space. And the other one is arte útil, or art as a tool, or useful art, meaning that the art is generated not because me, the artist, needs something, but because it's functioning is for the others. And it is formed because it's going to benefit somebody, not the artist, but somebody else, you know. So,
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think we need to generate spaces where we can have empathy. And I think both what Tania has said and Kate, both in terms of stories, but also, you know, doing things that are useful, as, you know, the concept of useful art is really important, because I think we need it more than ever. We need imagination, and we need hope, and we need empathy. And, you know, for me, that's why bringing these tools together, not tools so much, but you know, these lens together of art and migration, for example, is a really good way for us to look again and to think differently and to think more humanely and, yeah, to think more profoundly, hopefully.
Thanks. And I want to thank Kate Porterfield, Tania Bruguera, Ismail Einashe for helping us look at how art allows us, in Ismail's words, to sit with the stranger. And if there's one phrase I take away from this book as a kind of, okay, what does it mean for the practice of journalism and for the thinking that goes into it? And that I can look at art and look at life and look at the work that Kate does. It's how do we create space in which we sit with strangers, in which our listeners, viewers, readers, downloaders sit with strangers, and see where that leads in a different way. Thank you all. And for the last time tonight, yes?
Buy
Buy the book.
Thank you so much, Bruce.